On today's show, we have a mailbag edition pod with topics such as Cam Whitmore's body language drama, Rockets front office expectations, as well as what should the starting lineup be when this roster is fully healthy, and so much more. It's all coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Thursdays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets, where the best way you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform you're choosing. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Drop us a comment while you're there. Just do a drive-by, say Go Rockets. It helps us out a ton. Also, subscribe to the daily Locked On Rockets newsletter. Would sincerely appreciate that. Now, today's episode is sponsored by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off of your first purchase. And as always, thanks so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you so much for being an everydayer. Joining us now is your weekly co-host, none other than the Podfather himself, Rockets Wire editor and host of the Logger Line podcast, Ben DuBose. You can track down on Twitter at Ben DuBose. Here's we are doing a Locked On Rockets mailbag episode. It's been a minute since we've done a mailbag show. We got a lot of great submissions for today's episode, a lot of great topics that we're going to be tackling. First things first, though, before we get into the mailbag stuff, quick update on Fred VanVleet. Shout out to Daniel Lerner of the Houston Chronicle, who was in Washington, was able to ask Fred after the game kind of what happened on that play, that collision with Alex Sarr. And Fred simply said it was just knee-to-knee contact. He headed back to the locker room just to start the treatment a little bit earlier, since the Rockets, pretty much had the game won at that point. So nothing serious there, no hamstring injury, nothing to really worry about with Fred. So that's some good news. We didn't have that information available to us when Madison and I recorded our initial post-game pod. So with that, let's go ahead and, Ben, are you ready to dive into some of these mailbag questions?
Let's do it.
Okay. First and foremost, there are like a bunch of questions being asked about Cam Whitmore and his body language, his and some of the way things looked at the end of this game against the Wizards, with him kind of walking straight off the court and back to the locker room. Ben, what's your read on the Cam situation right now?
So there's a few angles to this. The first question I would ask anyone is the worst case scenario really that bad? We're not talking about a Christian Wood scenario from 2 years ago where a guy refused to go in a game. It's nothing like that. So even in
or
the
a guy
worst,
leaving at halftime, right? Getting in the car,
right,
hopping in the whip.
Yeah, so even in the worst case interpretation, and it's just an interpretation at this point, look, he's a 20-year-old in his second season who we knew going in was going to be asked a lot of. There's no one else on this team that was a rotation player as a rookie that all of a sudden was then sent to the G League in year two. There's a reason why we talked about this a lot during the offseason. We knew it would be difficult on Cam. And so if it is difficult on him, and we saw the awkward interview after the Dallas game, I think it's understandable. And I also think this is why you invest a lot of money in Ime Udoka, a top shelf head coach who's known as a culture guy, to handle. If it gets to a point where it's too much and he needs to not be around the team or go back to the G League or be traded, then I trust Ime Udoka to make that call. And he's got way more information than we do. And as far as what we've seen to this point, I haven't seen anything that suggests it's that big of a deal. And Ime Udoka's actions to me don't suggest it's a big deal, because he continues to have Cam around the team and continues to give him rotation opportunities. So my read is that it's probably not some of these worst case interpretations that you see. The other element that I think is being forgotten here with some of the more extreme reactions is the total lack of context. Look, I can see questioning Ime Udoka about basketball subjects. I'm not going to sit here and say, well, trust Ime no matter what, just because he has a great track record and he's highly paid. No, at the end of the day, when it comes to tough decisions like who to play in a basketball game, okay, we're all looking at the same footage. We're all looking at similar stats. And so reasonable people can disagree. When we're talking about stuff like someone's personal attitude and who they are as a teammate, as a person, we have maybe 1 to 2% of the information that Ime Udoka and the coaching staff in charge of day-to-day operations have. We, for the most part, are not behind the scenes. We're not in the locker room all that frequently. We definitely do not travel with the team. We're not with them on the bench. They have way, way more information than we do. So there's a total lack of context. And, just think of it with me or you. I could be having a great day, but if you focus on 5 to 10 seconds, even on a great day for me, you can make me seem like a malcontent, and vice versa. I can have a terrible day, and if you clip 5 or 10 seconds and post it to social media and watch it on loop, because that's the way Twitter works, you can be convinced that I'm having a great day when I'm really having a terrible one. And so it's very easy to make mountains out of molehills, especially younger players. We saw this at times the last 2 years. People wondered about the body language between Ime Thompson and Jalen Green. We saw 2 years ago when Jabari was a rookie, there was a brief argument during a timeout early in the year between Jabari and Jalen. People tried to make a huge deal out of those, and in reality, they were pretty much nothing burgers. And I think they're especially nothing burgers when you have Ime Udoka leading the team instead of Steven Silas. So I would say consider the context, trust Ime Udoka. That's why you brought him in. You don't need to make everything a 10-alarm fire. And the other point that I would raise, and I think it's similar to the context angle, there's a lot of backfilling and cherry picking that's going on, because once a narrative is set in place, and we know this started after the awkward interview following the Dallas game, there's been all these questions on social media about Cam's attitude. Is he bought in?
Well,
and
I think it started even before the Dallas interview, right? Because there was speculation about, is Cam in the doghouse? Why is he not playing?
Yeah, and we knew this was hard on him going back to the offseason. Yeah, for the reasons that we've gone through in the past. It's a lot to ask a second-year guy who was proven as a rookie. But when a narrative like that gets set on social media, it becomes very easy to cherry pick and sort of shoehorn everything into a one-size-fits-all narrative. And I think that's what's going on. Like the sequence at the end of the game, so it looked like Cam was wanting to pull up from three. He was actually really hot as a shooter. And so he nearly put up a three, but I think he realized, hey, shot clock's off. We're up by 20 something. We should probably just let the clock run out. And because he had picked up his dribble, obviously he couldn't dribble the time off the clock. So he had to sort of hot potato, give it to Aaron Holiday, who ran off the final 7-8 seconds, whatever it was. And Cam, walked to the locker room, gave a couple of low high fives, and may or may not have brushed Tari Eason. I would not make a big deal out of that, because if brushing someone like that in a narrow walkway is, some sign of, intense displeasure, I do that all the time. I mean, maybe I'm just too clumsy, but I didn't read that as a big deal at all. I think just imagine if the situation was totally reversed and Aaron Holiday was the guy who nearly put up a three, but then flipped the hot potato to Cam Whitmore because he had picked up his dribble. And then Aaron Holiday did the same thing, walking off the court, couple of low high fives, and maybe accidentally brushed somebody. Nobody would think anything of it at all. We're just making a bigger deal out of this because it's Cam Whitmore, because there are these other questions. And while I understand that, at the same time, it's important to not jump to conclusions, especially when you have someone like Ime Udoka running the show. So when you look at this, and we can all acknowledge there's missing context, there are alternative explanations, and you have a coaching staff that you really trust to handle this, I'm inclined to just say, you know what, if it comes out later that there's more to the story and ultimately Ime decides to discipline him or they trade him or whatever it may be, then we can come back to this weeks or months down the line and say, hey, maybe this was a sign that something wasn't right. But for now, I'm inclined to give the benefit of the doubt, especially when there's missing context and clearly there's another explanation that can explain some of this.
Yeah, and look, at the end of the day, too, there's the other one too, where it's like the Jalen Tari clip where they're like talking and people are trying to speculate on, oh well, Jalen's talking about how Cam pushed him and this, that, and the other. It's like we have no idea what that conversation was about, right? Like it's at this point the speculation on this, and to your point about what Cam, the whole narrative kind of attached to Cam at this point, it's very similar to kind of the narrative attached to say like Dillon Brooks, right? And how everything that Dillon Brooks does on a basketball court gets viewed under a microscope because of his reputation, because of being Dillon the villain. And so right now the same thing is happening to Cam, where every little thing, every little bit of body language, oh my God, he didn't stand up on the bench to clap and cheer for a 3-pointer that went in, like a couple of the other teammates did. And so now everything's being micro-analyzed at this point. Cam is an incredibly talented basketball player. He's incredibly young. And I think the most important point that you raise, and I agree wholeheartedly with this, if the Rockets had any other coach but Ime Udoka, then it's somebody that wasn't nearly as strong-willed as him, somebody that has the commanding presence that he does, and let's be honest, like does not tolerate any BS, then yeah, I'd maybe have a little bit more doubts about, okay, well, is there concerns here? Could it impact the locker room? What have you? Let Ime handle it. If it winds up becoming a thing, I think we can rest assured that Ime will address it and handle this situation as best as he sees fit to prevent it from him impacting the rest of the team if it ever were to get to that point, which I think you and I are in agreement right now. It's a big nothing burger. Let Cam live, and if Ime gets asked about it, maybe he does get asked about it here shortly, whether it be a radio interview or an in-person interview or something, and I'm sure that we'll get an answer from him that more or less squashes any and all concerns that are going on, because this is exactly what happened after the Dallas game, right? Cam had his comments the night of the game. Very next day, Ime does the radio interview on the Matt Thomas show and addresses it, and he's basically like, no, it's fine with me. Like, he didn't sugarcoat it. He addressed it, and then we moved on from there. So
this is the same coach that called LeBron James a soft ass boy. I do not think he's losing sleep over this.
Exactly. 1,000% agree. All right. Coming up, we're going to get into some of the expectations for the Houston Rockets of front office. A lot of pending front office questions on the horizon, as well as some other fun ones that we're going to get to a little bit down the line. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Look, live events are the absolute best. I love going to live events, whether it's a basketball game, a concert, theater, a comedy club. One of my favorite memories was going to a concert last year. The energy, the excitement, it was truly unforgettable, and I got the tickets on Game Time. And now Game Time's made it even easier to get tickets for your favorite events with their new feature, Game Time Picks. The feature filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of different ticketing offers. Just last week, I was looking for some Rockets tickets for a game a little bit later this month, trying to go with some friends, and using the Game Time app, it made it so simple. With Game Time Picks, you can find amazing deals and can even see the view from your seat before you buy. The super deal was really impressive, offering great seats at truly unbeatable prices. Plus, the app's all-in pricing shows the total cost up front with no surprise fees at checkout. They're so transparent throughout the whole process. So take the guesswork out of buying your tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. Today's episode is also brought to you by Rocket RX. Look, if you're ready to boost your confidence and take control in the bedroom, Rocket RX has the solution. Imagine feeling more prepared and performing at your best. Rocket RX makes it simple and stress-free. Rocket RX offers FDA-approved treatments for erectile dysfunction at a lower cost than branded alternatives. No more uncomfortable doctor visits or pharmacy trips. Everything is delivered straight to your door in discreet, plain packaging. With Rocket RX, you'll get trusted care from a real U.S. clinical team. Complete a quick 100% online consultation, and you can get your free prescription today. Visit rocketrx.com to get started now. It only takes a couple of minutes. Right now, our listeners can get 40% off your first order when you use code LOCKEDONNBA. That's rocketrx.com, code LOCKEDONNBA for 40% off your first order. Terms and conditions apply. Rocket RX, better sex made simple. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, Ben, our next mailbag question, our next couple mailbag questions here. Let's start with this one. Given how close y'all are to the front office, or at least closer than the listeners, is Stone thinking like Twitter fans and pundits? By that, I mean, is he looking to sacrifice the future dynasty or a future dynasty for a second round exit this year by chasing an established star? Take the lead on this one.
I don't think so. Every indication that I've gotten is that they are inclined to stay the course at least until next summer. And so once you have a full year of data or a full season of data from this group with Amen Thompson in year 2 taking the leap, then if there's a shortcoming, and especially once you have some playoff data to incorporate, and we can see if any of these flaws become much bigger concerns in a playoff setting, then yeah, at this point, they might get a little more aggressive. But for now, for a team that's overachieving and number 2 in the West, I don't see why you would push the envelope unless it's a deal that is insanely team friendly. I think, the biggest question we've had is Jalen Green, and he's come on very strong the last 6 weeks. So I'm inclined to say that unless there is an overwhelmingly positive value deal to the Rockets available, the likes of which they can say, look, whatever's potentially available later probably wouldn't compare from a value perspective. I think they just stay the course and get data from one season plus playoffs as is.
Piggybacking off that answer a little bit, there are a couple other questions, submissions asking, okay, what are the likelihood of seeing, a big trade made, in season ahead of the trade deadline for a De'Aaron Fox or a Devin Booker type. And at this point, it does feel De'Aaron Booker. There you go. Thank you for catching that almost Freudian slip. Look, at this point, it feels increasingly unlikely that we do see one of those moves because of a kind of the fact that those teams are, the asking price for those players is probably going to be a little bit too high. The leverage that the Rockets do have over both of those teams in those potential negotiations would probably be at its all-time high this upcoming offseason, much less so in the middle of the season when the Rockets, when those teams could paint the Rockets as, okay, well, hey, if you want to trade for this guy, if you want to acquire the star player and make a better push in the postseason this year, yada, 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 all those different things. I want to add one note, though, on the idea of, a mid-season trade for a potentially established star player. I will say the one player that is a little interesting that kind of would be a very short-term value move, and that's Kevin Durant.
Yeah.
And he's the one name that I know that the Rockets front office has kind of kicked the tires on previously and has had, a lot of interest in potentially acquiring in the past, in various situations. And because the Rockets own the Suns picks, and because KD could fit seamlessly into this Rockets roster, depending on what the asking price would be for a short-term rental of Kevin Durant, he's still producing at an elite level right now, and he would address the Rockets' biggest gaping hole on this roster, which is the lack of a closer, the lack of a true number one offensive option, a go-to bucket getter, and he would also fit in seamlessly with the defensive identity of this team. Now, are you shortchanging yourself a little bit by trading for KD and potentially including, one or two, or I don't know how many of the young guys you would need to include in that trade. I don't know how much future draft capital you would have to include in that trade. But again, if the price was low enough, I think the Rockets front office would absolutely entertain that deal in order to give themselves a legitimate contention window for the next 1 to 2 years, but they would only do it if it didn't damage their ability to form a long-term contender as well, and that's kind of the delicate balancing act here.
Agree, and I also think it depends on just how sustainable the current version of the Rockets is. That will influence it as well, and that we know the schedule is going to get more difficult over the next month. We'll have to see how they look without Jabari. I know they've looked good so far, but it's been just 2 games. We'll see if Tari comes back. And part of your willingness to make a deal for KD, even at a discounted price, would come from the idea that you think you're good enough with KD to actually be at least a quasi-contender this year. So the Rockets, to this point, they're 24-12. That's a very good start. But I do think that for this month leading up to the trade deadline, if they're going to think about KD at all, they want to see not only what a deal would look like from a value perspective with the Suns, and it would need to be on their terms, but they also want to see their current placement in the Western Conference, top 2, top 3 seed continue, because even if the value is right, if the team is falling off and it looks like that even if you bring in KD, you're not going to be able to even think about contending this year, then it may not be worth it when you consider, even a discounted KD price is still going to be a pretty high price because it's KD. And even at 36, he has the type of game that should age fairly gracefully. And, you just look at LeBron James as a template for a guy going into his late 30s, even early 40s. So some of it's also going to depend on, the context of the current Rockets and how they perform. But I agree with you. KD is different than the other older players simply because he's so good that he actually could put you over the top. When you look at someone like Jimmy Butler, it's not that he wouldn't make you better, but I don't think he would make you so much better by himself that he would put you in a new tier, especially when you then have to deal with the question of his next contract and is he worth that, and how does that play into your ability to re-sign other members of your young core. With KD, because he so clearly, even at 36, is of a higher tier, under the right circumstances, I do think they would consider it. But I agree that it's probably not going to happen. It's just one that you can't completely rule out. I agree that Fox and Booker are the more likely targets, and it's more likely this summer than at the trade deadline. One other point that I would like to raise on this: keep in mind the Rockets have a lot of leverage here, in that these other teams, especially the Phoenix Suns, need the Rockets. So you do not need to rush into that. The Suns are incentivized to deal with the Rockets because Houston owns their picks. With De'Aaron Fox, everyone knows he is from Houston. Everyone knows the Rockets have a deep stockpile of young players and draft picks. The Rockets are working from an advantaged position. That's before we even consider that, by the way, the Kings have won 5 straight games, and they just went through a coaching change, which does not indicate that they're wanting to do something, as far as blowing up the team anytime soon anyway. But even if a team like that was open to moving Booker or Fox, my guess is that if the Rockets want to wait, and I think it benefits the Rockets to wait so they get more information on young players, we see just how sustainable this Jalen run is and so on and so forth, then those other teams, it's to their advantage to wait out the Rockets as well, because the Rockets are in a unique bargaining position with certainly the young players, the picks, and in the case of Phoenix, owning the literal picks of the Phoenix Suns.
On that note, out of all the picks, this is our next mailbag question. Out of all the picks that the Rockets own from other teams, if you had to trade all but one, which one do you think is the most valuable? Which one do you think would be the one that you want to keep the most?
2027 Phoenix. To me, that's the one, because I think if Phoenix does blow it up, or if, they go off the rails this year and, I don't know, pivot into something of a rebuild, by 2029, there's so many things that can change. But I feel pretty confident that the Phoenix Suns by 2027 are going to be a bad basketball team. If they stay the course, then they're going to age out. Situations are going to get crazy. And if they rebuild, they're not going to have enough time for the next generation to, mature and take the next step forward. So I would say 2027 Phoenix, 29, 30, that's so far out, a lot of things can change. But I feel pretty confident it's currently constructed. The 2027 Phoenix Suns have a bad outlook. The West should still be pretty deep as well. And so because of that, that's number one on my list.
I think I've got to agree with you on the 2027. However, I would say if the Rockets were able to trade these swap rights that they have this year on the Phoenix pick, then I'd say this year the 2025 swap would be the most valuable one, because right now you're looking at it, the Suns are that pick is sitting at 9th right now. That's how bad Phoenix has been this season. If I do a quick lottery sim, I was trying to hope. Can I do a couple quick lottery sims? Come on, let's jump up in the lottery. Okay, it's not happening. Okay, I've done like 5 spins. Oh, there it is, 3rd overall pick. We did it, Ben. Okay, no. Look, so the Rockets own the swap rights for this year's draft pick with the Phoenix Suns. It's sitting at 9th right now. We know exactly what happened this past year's draft. The Rockets had the Brooklyn Nets pick, the swap rights, or I apologize, there's the outright pick from the Brooklyn Nets that was sitting at 9th, and it jumped up to number 3 overall, and that's how they got their hands on Reed Shepherd. This year has a draft with so much top end talent: Cooper Flagg, Ace Bailey, Dylan Harper, like so many different prospects at the top of this draft. It is a much deeper, much stronger draft than last year's draft. And right now the Rockets cannot trade that pick. They can't do anything with it because of the Stepien rule. But with that, I do think that pick has an immense amount of value as well. Last one here, Ben, about trades and front office moves and whatnot. What is the absolute maximum that you'd be willing to give up in a trade package for Devin Booker? We've talked a lot about De'Aaron Fox on this show. We haven't talked too much about Devin Booker yet.
That's interesting. Certainly you'd have to give them the 3 first-round picks. Basically, the 3 picks or swap rights that the Rockets own in conjunction with the Suns, or if it delayed until the offseason, then whatever the Suns pick turns into, because you probably wouldn't want to play someone that young anyway in a timeline where you're adding Devin Booker and wanting to win now. So I would say 4 first-round assets, but when I say first-round assets, probably the 3 Phoenix picks and 1 core guy that's not Amen Thompson or Alperen Sengun. So that would be probably the most, and we'll see what the salary filler looks like, and maybe there's like a 4.5, like a fringe prospect. But I would say 4 first-round picks, especially if the guy wants out of his current situation and you have leverage over that team the way the Rockets do with the Suns. 4 first-round picks in value is about the most I've seen. So I think the 3 Phoenix assets and 1 non-Amen or Sengun young piece, to me, that would be a reasonable starting place. And if they want a little bit more value, you can talk about that. But I wouldn't go crazy in terms of the base value beyond something equivalent to 4 first of unprotected, that is.
Yeah, I think I'd go about the same as you. I think I'd maybe, I feel like you'd almost be forced to include at least 1 other young prospect.
Probably, but you could sort of pick, and that's why I say like 4.5 maybe.
Yeah. And I will say the really interesting thing about any potential Devin Booker trade down the pipeline, especially if it waits until this offseason, and we'll have a better idea of what this looks like come May once the NBA draft lottery takes place. But depending on how badly the Phoenix Suns wind up performing this season, we know that they're kind of in damage control mode. They're looking to make a Bradley Beal trade. They're trying to find a 3rd team sooner so they can bring Jimmy Butler into Phoenix because they think Jimmy Butler's going to solve all their problems, which I don't think he will. the Suns are in shambles right now. They are in free fall, and things do not look good over there. That swap for this upcoming draft, the 2025 NBA draft, has so much value, Ben, that I think there's a world where if that pick does convey and wind up being somewhere in the range of like top 5, I think that it becomes a very interesting hypothetical of, would you rather keep that pick and be able to draft yet another young talent who, again, do you have the developmental runway for? If you can get a Cooper Flag, do you pass on a Cooper Flag for an established Devin Booker? Like, that becomes a very interesting dilemma here. And I do think that if that pick were to convey, somewhere in the top 5 range, then you have a really strong bargaining chip with the Suns to say, hey, look, you can start your rebuild right now with a top prospect, and we'll give you some more draft capital back. And then the Rockets might not have to include, multiple young guys, multiple young prospects, because you already have that one concrete kind of prospect that you could draft in this year's draft, be it, Ace Bailey, Cooper Flag, whoever, right? Wherever that pick ultimately lands. So that's going to be a really interesting kind of dynamic to follow later this season.
And one other thing to follow is the performance of Jalen Green, because whether Jalen's in the trade or not, at the same time, his value is definitely a part of the calculus, because even if you don't send him to Phoenix in a Booker deal and you're looking at a backcourt of Jalen and Booker, theoretically, well, if Jalen is able to continue the level of play that he's had since the day before Thanksgiving, then the Rockets won't be desperate for Booker. He would still make them better, but they wouldn't be as desperate if the version of Jalen Green that we've seen for the last 6 weeks, the last 17 games, averaging about 22.5 points, 4.5 rebounds per game, true shooting 57-58%, above average from three-point range. If that continues, and that's a big if, because we've seen these flashes from Jalen before and we're not even at 20 games yet, but if that continues, if Jalen is theoretically part of a package, he's 6 years younger than Devin Booker, so between a guy who's on the upswing and 6 years younger, you would probably have to give less with him if this version appears legitimate, but also you're less desperate to make a trade, period, if this version of Jalen is legitimate. And so because of that, that plays into the leverage that you have or don't have as well.
Absolutely fantastic point. Coming up, we're going to get into our final set of mailbag questions. Who would you like to see benched in order to keep Ime Thompson in the starting lineup once everybody is healthy? Favorite moments from the season so far? Favorite piece of Rockets gear that we both own? We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Ultimate College Basketball HC. Look, I want to tell you about this brand new mobile game that I'm really excited about, Ultimate College Basketball HC. If you've ever dreamed about being a college basketball head coach, this is your chance to step into those shoes. In Ultimate College Basketball HC, you control every detail of your program, from recruiting players and hiring coaching staff to overseeing training camps, handling NIL deals, and managing scholarships. It's all in your hands. And when it comes to game time, you get to draw up offensive plays and set your strategy. The way you play won't just affect the current season, it will shape the future of your school's basketball program. It's a game that lets you feel the full weight and responsibility of what it means to be a head coach and lead your team to glory. Here's a special offer for our Locked On Rockets listeners. Use promo code LOCKEDONCBB, all caps, inside the game store to get a free boost for your program. It's the perfect way to kickstart your coaching career. Download Ultimate College Basketball HC. Just visit ultimate-cbb.com or look it up on the App Store. Ultimate College Basketball HC. Begin your coaching legacy today. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, Ben. Ime Thompson's been in the starting lineup in and out of his very young career, right? We saw him take over a starting role last season when Alperen Sengun went down due to injury. We've seen him, plugged in as a starter, intermittently here and there for guys like Dillon Brooks, for Fred VanVleet, for whoever has missed time on this Rockets roster. And now he's going to be in the starting lineup for an extended period of time with no Jabari Smith Jr. due to the broken left hand. So the Rockets are going to be presented with a very interesting dilemma as Jabari Smith Jr. heals and recovers, and once he is healthy and back. What do the Rockets do? Because I am hard-pressed to imagine them being able to remove Ime Thompson from the starting lineup. So the question, the mailbag question specifically was, would you rather bench Fred VanVleet or Jabari to make way for Ime Thompson? And I think that could be maybe just extended to see, what should the starting five be once this team is truly healthy?
Unfortunately, my bet is that it's going to be Jabari, and I feel bad for him because he's played well, and it's certainly not his fault. But I think politically, this is a very dicey subject, and I think if this team plays well over the next month, and if Amin Thompson is a big part of that, and I think we both expect that to be the case, then I think it's easiest for the Rockets to say, you know what, 2 months until the playoffs, we're playing well in a good spot. We're not going to change what's working because I can't imagine a man coming out of the starting lineup at this point simply because the best version of the Rockets depends on maximizing Amin Thompson. He might be your best player on a per minute basis already. And if you don't start him, you are artificially capping his minutes at about that 28 to 30 range. Because if he's not going to play the first 6 minutes of the first and third quarters, then the max is 36. But he's obviously not going to play 18 minutes consecutively in the first and second halves.
However, Ime's done that to him a few times this season. Is ridiculous.
Occasionally, but you're not going to do it on a regular basis. And so you're going to end up in the 28 to 30 range. And so if you want him closer to 38, which is where he's been since starting, he's got to start so you're not artificially taking 12 of the 48 minutes off the table. So I think as the Rockets get closer to the playoffs and they want to maximize every margin, and it becomes real that the playoffs this year are realistic and that they can actually do some damage in the playoffs if their current level of play continues, not just a top shelf defense, but Jackson, I noted this on my Twitter timeline today. Did you realize that Rockets are a top 10 offense now? I mean, since Jalen Green got going, the offense has come along as well. So if you buy into the current version of the Rockets, I think you've got to maximize Amin Thompson, and that means starting him. I don't think they're ready to take Fred VanVleet out of the starting lineup just yet. I think they rely on him a lot to control the ball, to control pace, either playing faster or slower, depending on what they need, to provide some element of floor spacing and off-ball movement. I think it's just easier politically, especially with Jabari being just 21 years old, year 3, coming off an injury, to say, hey, you know what, this is working right now. We'll see what happens in the future. And we know during the offseason, it could be, a big trade changes the calculus anyway moving forward. And so I just think if the Rockets play well over the next month, and I expect them to, and I think Amin is going to look great, then this is the opportunity to say, you know what, we're just going to stick with what's working. And unfortunately, Jabari just drew the short straw this year with his injury.
It's a couple other points in that regard. First off, I do think that by having Amin in the starting lineup, we're already seeing a version of the Rockets where Fred VanVleet has taken more of an ancillary role offensively so that Jalen Green can get more of the lead guard reps. But we're also seeing Amin Thompson getting plenty of reps handling the basketball, attacking in the half court, all that. And so these are going to lead to increased reps for both Jalen and Amin. So down the line, when you do conceivably move on from Fred VanVleet, if that's what the Rockets ultimately decide to do, be it at some point this season, if they do something drastic with him ahead of the trade deadline, or if they just decide not to bring him back this offseason, or if they do want to bring him back but restructure the deal and maybe bring him back as a backup rather than the true starting point guard of this team if he wants to stick around in Houston long term, then you're helping further prepare Jalen and Amin for life post Fred VanVleet by giving them all of those reps. So it's kind of the best of both worlds in still having Fred, still having him as the calming influence out there and kind of your safety blanket, if you will, when going gets tough, when you need the steady veteran hands to kind of set the table, but you're letting Jalen and Amin take the brunt of the work offensively by handling the basketball. And one more point to add about Jabari is if you do bring him off the bench, first off, you allow Jabari to effectively fill that backup 5 role, which we've seen him do throughout various points of the season. And I feel like that's honestly maybe where he's been the most effective is playing that backup 5 role next to, or, when Alperen and Sengun's off the floor, gives the Rockets kind of a different lineup, a much more versatile defensive lineup. It's kind of their like little secret weapon, right? It's their version of like the Warriors, like death ball lineup, being able to put Jabari at the 5 and switch everything without giving up too much size or rebounding, because that's what Jabari brings to the table as well. And then the last point I have is, I don't think that the Rockets would do this maliciously, but the side benefit of if you bring Jabari off the bench,
contract,
the contract negotiations this upcoming offseason, you're kind of capping his ability to ramp up his counting stats, which would, again, hurt his ability and hurt his leverage in potential contract negotiations down the line. We've talked about this with Tari Eason as well earlier this season when he was capped on his minutes on a per night basis while he was kind of working his way back. And now Tari has been out for an extended stretch of games, so that's also going to hurt his ability to negotiate any potential contract extension. So the Rockets might be able to walk themselves into a couple of favorable extensions for both Jabari and Tari, given the situations regarding both of those guys this season.
And especially with Tari on the bench, I think it's hard to imagine a world where a 21-year-old Jabari Smith Jr. is so entitled that he raises a huge fuss over going to the bench when someone as quality as Tari Eason and Ime Thompson, for that matter, have been coming off the bench most of this year. I think most players, maybe all players in that locker room, know just how talented that group is. And on many nights, the bench is better than the starters anyway. So I don't think Jabari has a huge ego to begin with. But even if there's some element of that, then I think having someone in the same draft class that's played as well as Tari has when he's healthy, that's come off the bench basically his entire career in Houston, will make it much more understandable to Jabari. One other point on Fred that I wanted to raise. I listened to your pod the other day. I agree with you about scaling down Fred's role, especially with Jalen on the upswing. But where I draw the line, and I see this a lot on social media from people who are wanting to move on from Fred entirely. You want to play more young guys. I know what Reed did in the G League last night, and so on and so forth. Shooting percentages do not correlate all that strongly with spacing. Now, over a very large sample, they can. But I've seen the notion from a lot of people that Fred is not providing spacing because he's shooting, 32%, whatever it is. That's absolutely ridiculous. That's, analogous to a couple of years ago. Remember when KJ Martin had that one year that he shot like 36% from three, and we were trying to talk ourselves into him being like a long-term small forward for this team? No, it was a flukish thing in a small sample. And even if he was shooting respectively that year, teams were not game planning for him or looking at him as a threat from those spots on the floor. They were happy to have him take those shots, excuse me. Well, Fred VanVleet, even if he's shooting in the low 30s this year, watch how teams defend him. Don't just look at the stat sheet. Watch how teams defend him. They are not comfortable giving Fred those looks from three because there is a large body of work in the NBA that tells you that he can shoot at an elite level. We can quibble with his shot selection. We can worry about exactly how he's going to age, especially the more, speed and burst dependent elements of his game. We can talk about needing to boost the playmaking reps for Jalen, for Reed, maybe Cam. I understand, agree with all of that, at least to an extent. But Fred VanVleet still has clear value as a floor spacer. And even if the numbers aren't showing it this year, that value is still there. And I do think that's why it's hard to imagine him coming out of the starting lineup this year, assuming he stays on the roster.
Agree with you 100%. Like scouting reports and the way that teams guard and the way spacing is kind of calculated by opposing teams and whatnot. It's like a reputation thing, right? You look at like the entire player's body of work to make a decision on, okay, how are we going to guard this guy? Do we consider them a weak link in the offense? Are we going to give them those shots? Absolutely not. The way teams guard and close out on Fred VanVleet, they do not want him shooting threes because on any given night, Fred can go off, right? He can catch fire from three because he is a good shooter, even though the percentages don't back that up. Completely agree with you there. Great point. All right, two more quick ones before we wrap this one up. What has been your favorite moment from the season so far? Take it away, Ben.
The 7-0 run to close the game against the Warriors. I'll be quick. That was the best crowd of the year. Obviously, there were the added stakes of the NBA Cup, the long losing streak against the Warriors, and then the way they ended that game. Say what you will, but Bill Kennedy made the right call, according to the NBA League office. And so to go to the line with 3.5 seconds left, and for Jalen Green, under all that pressure, and we know the scrutiny he's been under, to make both of those free throws, and then for Jabari Smith to block the potential winner from the Warriors, we know Jalen and Jabari, they are the two guys that go back to the Stephen Silas years. We know they have been through hell, and this franchise has been through hell and back with the Golden State Warriors. And so to finish the game on a 7-0 run, get that monkey off your back in a national TV high leverage setting, and for Jalen and Jabari to be the two guys that make the winning plays in the final 5 seconds of the game, to me, that's as good as it gets against an all-time rival.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I don't think there's even a moment that comes secondarily close to that one because the Warriors win was so big and the way that they won, right? With Jalen making the play, diving for the loose ball on the ground, easily the biggest moment, the best moment of his career up to this point, making, and it was a hustle play, right? It wasn't a bucket. It wasn't a crazy three. It wasn't a high flying dunk. It was a hustle play, him diving on the floor, getting it out of the mud and then knocking down the clutch free throws. And again, the big time Jabari block, just awesome stuff all around. Great
Minnesota game too, but
the Minnesota win was good, but it did not have the gravity behind it that the Warriors game did. That was easily, I think, the biggest game that this Rockets team has played literally since the James Harden era.
I don't think even though it won the NBA Cup group, I don't think anyone printed NBA Cup group champion shirts to my knowledge.
I want the banner in the rafters, Ben. Nobody beats this team.
Western Conference Group A.
There you go. Yeah, we'll do
Group
that.
Group A champions. Yeah.
I'm gonna head down to Kinko's right now and get the banner printed. All right. Last question. What has been your favorite Rockets gear that you've acquired? I have a good story for this one.
So are we thinking just apparel or memorabilia?
I think let's say both. I'll extend it to both. It said gear, so I was thinking maybe it went a minute pair, but we'll do memorabilia as well. So
Okay, so memorabilia, this is an easy one, but I'll go with the throwback jacket that I wore on last week's show, simply because my in-laws got it for me for Christmas, and with the current weather in Houston, I'm wearing it all the damn time. And my wife and I are actually going to the Knicks Nets back-to-back at the beginning of February as fans in New York, and so I'm sure I will wear that pretty much the entire New York trip. So throwback jacket. It's very recency bias because I got it for Christmas, but yeah, the old logo ties back into my early fandom as a child in the 1990s. So yeah, that's my choice. And then as far as memorabilia, brought it here for the show. The simplest thing, but I still enjoy it. The Alperen Sengun, I am so happy talking bobblehead. It is the simplest concept. It is an amazing concept, and it is one of the few bobbleheads that when you're in a marriage like I am, you sort of have to pick and choose your spots. And so I do not, contrary to what people who know me online might think, I do not have a downstairs full of, sports memorabilia in the living area, because obviously I have to draw a line between my interest, her interest, not trying to look like a 12-year-old kid who's, using the living room like his own bedroom as a diehard sports stand. But one of the few pieces that I do keep in the living room, and one of the prime areas when you come in my home, is the Sengun talking bobblehead, because even though it's simple, it's fun, and it speaks, so well to this very happy era of Rockets basketball as they're back on the upswing.
I absolutely love the Sengun bobblehead. That's a great call out. I want to give a lot of credit to the Rockets too for bringing back that same concept with the bobblehead, with the Rudy Tomjanovich bobblehead that also has a speaker in the bottom, and it says, he does the "Don't ever underestimate the heart of a champion." There we go. Look, it's
I'm so happy on the back of it. Yeah.
Yeah, the Rockets have been really creative with some of the bobbleheads over the last couple of years. Fantastic stuff there. For me, my favorite piece of Rockets gear that I own, and I will turn a little bit, if you've watched this program with any regularity, I have the jerseys hanging in the background. So I've got the Olajuwon jersey, an autographed Olajuwon jersey. I also have the autographed Vernon Maxwell jersey, but it's the story behind the Mad Max jersey. Every so often, Max goes on Twitter and he'll, say, hey, I've got some jerseys to move. If you want to buy one, go for it. And this was very early on in my tenure as the host of the show. And I remember this. I messaged Max and I emailed him. I said, hey, I want to buy one of the signed jerseys. But then in the email, and I debated on this, like I was like sitting there for like an hour thinking, should I do this? Should I not do this? But I emailed him asking for one of the jerseys. And at the very bottom, I put PS F the Jazz. And I also put like a pitch in there. I was like, I host a Rockets podcast. Like, I'd love to have you on the show. And he replied back in like 3 minutes and said, you had me at F Utah. And he was like, when and where? And I'm down to be on the show. And so that's how I got Max on the show. And he's been back a couple different times, and we still keep in touch with one another. He's an awesome guy. And so that is my favorite piece of Rockets merch, just based on the story that also goes with it, because it is so Mad Max to a T that that I was able to get him on the show by basically insulting the Utah Jazz. So with that,
I have something like that I would need to dig up. I think it's actually at my house in Beaumont, but I bring it up every time I go home for the holidays. When I was a kid, I went to Matt Bullard's basketball camp a couple of times, and I have pictures with him. I have a signed certificate. And so every time that I would do a podcast with Bull or I see him at a game, I'll remind him of when he taught me when I was 8, 9 years old, and he was at the peak of his, championship or near championship powers, that I was in the Matt Bullard basketball camp. And I've got signed photos, signed shirt, all that good stuff. And I used to bring it up all the time when he would, join me on the show. So I guess that's my version of that.
I love it. I love it so much. All right, Ben, you know the drill. Let everyone know where to track you down at.
Yep. Ben DuBose on Twitter/X, the Logger Line, and the Rockets Wire on the same, and rocketswire.usatoday.com for all your daily Houston Rockets news coverage.
And that's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Rockets. As always, thanks so much for checking out the show. If you didn't hear your mailbag question answered in this episode, stay tuned. I'm going to try my best to get to a second mailbag episode a little bit later this week, where I wrap up the ones that we weren't able to tackle in this episode in particular. And if you didn't get a chance to submit a question, go do a drive-by, submit the question either on the YouTube comment section or on the Twitter post that I made, all that stuff. Give me your thoughts. I love doing the mailbags questions. It's great to kind of interact and answer some of what you guys have at the forefront of your mind. But as always, thanks so much for checking out the show. Remember, the best way you can help us grow the show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Drop the comments while you're there. Subscribe to the daily Locked On Rockets newsletter. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.